into Your Life with Julianne Williams. I am so glad you joined me today. Our episode is going to be a little different than normal. What I've done is included a video of a podcast that was made with some people that I work with at Fusion Conflict Strategies. The topic is let's break the taboo around grief in the workplace. And as many of you know, I am a certified grief educator, and I am very passionate about serving people and helping people understand grief and how we can negotiate our coping through grief to come out with more peace than pain. And so when you watch this episode, I encourage you to listen to it not just from the perspective of grief in the workplace, because I think the principles that are shared can be applied in any area of our life. And as we have experienced so much grief over the last few years, whether it be from the pandemic or from things that happen in the world around us, I thought I just might share this today, and it might help someone better support someone around them, or to learn something about how to better think about their grief journey. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to the podcast of 1 + 1 = 3, Turmoil to Triumph. Hello, everyone. This is Julianne Williams, and welcome to the podcast 1 + 1 = 3, Turmoil to Triumph. We have a really exciting episode today, and it is called Let's Break the Taboo About Grief in the Workplace. With us today, we have guests from Fusion Conflict Strategies, LLC, Brandon Bigelow, Liz Vindiola, and Nicole Redstone. And we're going to talk a little bit about how grief does affect us in the workplace. Now, just to introduce, grief is a silent subject, and it is one that affects all of us, especially those of us that are in the helping professions or those of us that work directly with individuals in the workplace. So today I'm going to introduce some basic principles on grief, share some ideas about what to say, and just introduce some specific types of grief and what they're called so that you can identify them when you're talking to people. So again, quickly, grief is a natural response to death or loss. It's the process we experience to properly acknowledge a loss and to heal. And we often hear about someone who is grieving or mourning. And so the difference between those two is that grief is a very individual experience, and it's the work we're doing on the inside. Mourning is the work that we do that is seen by others. No one has the same response or reaction, and we can never judge someone by the depth of the sorrow that we see. And so let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of grief so that when you are talking with people after they've had a loss, you can have a good idea about what they might be experiencing. So we hear often about delayed grief. So sometimes an employee or a team member that we work with may have had a loss some time ago, but they don't feel it in the moment because it's not safe or they're in survival mode, but it may come out at another time. Disenfranchised grief is grief that we judge or minimize. Ambiguous grief, that is grief that's hard to see, usually at the loss, like a miscarriage, or even someone who is engaged to be married and it's not seen as their spouse, but they feel as though their spouse has passed. Sometimes people judge that as not as significant. Inconclusive grief, this is where there's no body to grieve. And we see and hear about those things with people who disappear and whatnot. And in this case, we see people frequently develop like conspiracy theories because they're just trying to find answers. Collective and public grief. And this is something I believe we need to really hone in on in the workplace. And that is when we grieve as a group relative to an event or a public figure, because we have had so many of those things in the recent past, starting with the pandemic. And then anytime someone like Jimmy Buffett, who just passed away, people are sad. It's the end of an era, and it may activate other types of grief. It also may be mass shootings or other things like that we now hear so much in the news, because it really is something that I think makes us feel all vulnerable, and again can activate feelings that were there. And then the last grief that I just kind of wanted to talk about is secondary loss, and there are many others, but that's the losses that accompany grief in addition to the primary emotional response. So you may have someone who lost something, and by the way, grief is losing a job, it's also having an adverse health effect, it's having a child that is suffering, not sort of turning out the way we plan. So when you're seeing things with the people that you work with, it may not be just that they've lost a loved one to death, but that secondary loss is when events happen. So for instance, I lost my husband. When my children have significant events, like when they graduated from high school, there's a secondary loss of for them and for me of not having him present. And so that does happen. And so, these are the things that you might see with people that you work with. And I think it's important just to understand how wide the net is of grief. Because then, as we talk about the things that Liz, Brandon, and Nicole are going to bring up, it makes sense from a human resources and conflict and communication perspective on how we can improve our workplace to become the employer of choice. So Liz, I know that you wanted to talk with us a little bit about how managers can help people in the grieving process.
Right. Thank you, Julianne. Hello, everyone. So, right. We, we would like to see like that break. We want to break that taboo about talking about grief in the workplace. So how can we do that? How can managers help with that? So, I recently read a Harvard Business Review article, which talked about three phases of mourning. So one is marked by defiance and anger, one by despair, pain, and disorganization, and one by slow reorganization and reinvestment in life. So, we as workers are expected to, you know, deal with the grief. We're given bereavement, whether that be, 5, 10 days. I remember when my mom passed away in 2015, I was given 5 days. And that included the time when she was in the hospital and she passed away. And then also, a week later, I have to go to her funeral. So honestly, it wasn't a lot of time. So, I mean, we as workers are expected to deal with the grief and brush ourselves off and come back to work. But the reality is that grief isn't, it doesn't unfold in a neat and linear manner. Grieving workers, they go through, they have progressions and they have regressions, right? Um, and grief can stay with you for years, and then it could, you could feel like you're okay, and then it can flare up like years later. So the first thing, I'm going to talk about how managers can help with that. And one is to be present. So acknowledge the loss and show empathy. Reach out to the employee, small gestures, send a card, send flowers, let them know that, you're there. If, encourage discussion, um, because as it is, managers represent the organization, and their demonstration of support is a signal that the workplace cares. So, yeah, showing empathy and just being there for the employees. So, number two is be patient. So, managers should understand that grief remains intense and can flare up years later, as I mentioned. Understanding the loss of the shock of loss is a time of ambivalence. So the inconsistencies. So an employee that has always shown that they're a hard worker, that they're always there, that they're willing to go above and beyond. So grief destabilizes that. It destabilizes the focus and the your drive. So it's managers should understand that that does not mean that the employee no longer cares or has lost their drive or their focus. They're just going through that moment. And then number three is so I'm sorry. So going back to number two is managers can be patient and recognize that these behaviors can avert. If they're patient and they recognize that, it could avert a good deal of misunderstanding and conflict. So that's where the conflict comes in. And then managers should know and hold them to the same regard as they did before. This is just they're just going through their moment. Number three is managers can be open. So managers should feel free to share about their own experiences because that's going to help employees break down their walls and be comfortable with sharing their own stories and their own experiences. Because if you're interested in creating an environment where people are willing to talk about loss, the best way is to model that behavior. So, and if they haven't experienced loss or death, I'm sure they have dealt with some kind of struggle in life. So, talking about that and showing that it's okay to talk about grief or struggles or pain. So those are my couple thoughts on
Liz,
how.
I think those are wonderful tips. And, to your point, one thing that's really important, and I didn't say in the intro that I am a certified grief educator. One thing that's really important when we are speaking with people about a loss, whether it be of a person or a situation, a child, is using the name of the person or the situation that they are struggling through, that they are grieving, that they are mourning, because that acknowledges. And I know that, when you lose a person, especially, we never want them to be forgotten. And so when we remember them by their name, it is really comforting to the person that we're speaking with.
Yes.
Thank you for those wonderful tips.
Oh, of course. You're welcome.
Brandon, you wanted to share a story with us to impart a bit of wisdom. And so I just wanted to introduce Brandon Bigelow and let you go ahead and talk with us a little bit and share some of your interesting information.
Thanks, Julianne. And thank you, Liz. And just partnering, or I should say, maybe piggybacking off of what my business partner, Liz, just said, which I think were wonderful reminders of those steps that are, and there's obviously many more as you deal with, situations that are foreign to a lot of us. It's one thing that, to be empathetic within families and to really be there for close members of our families or very close friends. That's one thing. But when it's in an environment that is many people we don't know as well within our workplace, and perhaps we didn't even know the person that well, who either lost someone in their family or maybe that person themselves is no longer with us, and how do we help the coworkers who were very close to that person? I have a confession to make, and that is that over the years, and I've spent the majority prior to forming Fusion Conflict Strategies with my two business partners who are on this podcast with us today. My confession is, despite the fact that I would say I'm a pretty empathetic person, and I've always been described that way. Certainly, I have I have a lot more flaws than we have time for me to list today. But one thing that I think I do an okay job, at least, is providing empathy. And it's not anything that you learn or that can be taught. It's just part of your soul. It's part of your personality, which comes from obviously genetics and environmental factors and all those things. But one thing that has been a real struggle has been, and prior to forming Fusion Conflict Strategies, I'd spent 25, 26 years as a healthcare executive. And so this quarter century, you're going to have loss within the workplace, especially running very large organizations. You just have a lot of people, and of course, unfortunately, tragedy is just a part of all of our lives. And so when for that many years, you're gonna deal with a fair amount of loss, either directly within your workforce or family members of those who work with you. And so my confession today is despite the fact that I'm pretty empathetic, I think, especially early on in my career, a lousy job of knowing and perhaps not knowing what to say and how to act, and trying to give an abundance of space to people who, and it comes from a good place, yet I struggle even to this day to know what is appropriate. And because, these folks who work with me, and even though we have a good relationship, they're not family. They're getting an abundance of people within their family reaching out, and I just don't want to step on toes. I don't want to often crowd that space and I want to leave that space for people who are close in their lives, right? So I've struggled with that for many years. But where I think and I want to list just really quick and then share just a personal account, list some steps that that from my learning. These are things that have been cemented as a manager, as someone in charge, or whatever your role within an organization. If you help administer programs or a manager of any kind, I think it's important to find that balance of not intruding, but also go with your gut when it tells you, be there for them. And by reaching out to them, you're not trampling on things that are held sacred for only certain people in their lives. So the 5 steps that have been cemented in my mind, that just for me, that I've struggled with, but I think I'm getting a little bit better at, and hopefully will reach that Mount Everest of knowing how I can eventually become really, really good at this. But first of all, acknowledge the loss. Again, we stumble over our toes, and we sometimes don't want to take that step forward and even acknowledge it because we feel like it's too painful of a thing. But acknowledge it. There have been many studies that show that those who are going through grief, many of the things that they wish had happened during that process was that people who felt handcuffed and for whatever reason didn't want to intrude, quote, intrude in that space. They wish that they would have had those people who felt handcuffed actually reach out, because they greatly appreciate it. And remember, a work family is every bit of family. We spend at least a third of our lives with these people. And so that's the kind of relationship we should have. Second is offer flexibility. This is a point. I know that we have rigid policies and programs within many of our companies. But if we work for a company or we own a company where flexibility is not given to people who are grieving, we're doing something wrong. Obviously, there's laws written about the time that people are able to take off for grief and so forth. But I'm not talking so much about that. I just personally reaching out and saying, hey, whatever you need and however long you need to take off, or if this is difficult to reacclimate to the position, let's find something that works for a period of time. Providing resources is number 3. We should never be shy to offer counseling resources, even if it's just an 800 number for a grief counselor. Now, maybe on the continuum of good, better, best, maybe that's good. Maybe a better or best practice would be, referring them to somebody directly, or even better, maybe there's someone that they know within the company who has credentials. Julianne's a great example of someone who's done a lot of things and also has extended herself into the grief counselor space in a certified manner, and which is wonderful that she's able to put herself in a position to do that. Offer those resources, especially people they know that are qualified to do that. Number 4 is check in regularly. I've been like most people who are listening to the podcast, we've all had loss. And when I've experienced loss, to have a one-time check-in, and again, I'm not expecting people to do cartwheels and have to serve me in extra ways. I mean, everyone's busy, but a quick check-in and then never hearing from them again, it doesn't knock them down a notch in my book, but I do appreciate when it's not just let me know what you need from me, but hey, I wanted to let you know I'm thinking about you, and I've had the impression I should do X, Y, and Z. Please let me know if that's appropriate. Giving specific examples of things you can do rather than just saying, let me know if you need me. That's really important. And then finally, we as managers especially, we need to adjust their workload and expectation. I've already kind of alluded to that, but we need to be very cognizant of getting other members of the team to take up the load, as it were, and help them reacclimate. It's not just just saying it's okay if it takes time to get back into your job, but talking to other people, especially in their department, and having a meeting and saying, guys, this is going to be very difficult transition back. What can we do to help shoulder that load? And then briefly, I'll just conclude with just a very quick story. Many years ago, probably 20 years ago, I was running a skilled nursing facility, and it was just the most tragic thing. A member of our staff, this woman, her husband and 3 of her children were tragically killed in a car wreck. And it was one of those where the arms of the train stop didn't come down, and didn't see it, and it was it was too late by the time they got on the track, and then train hit them and lost her entire family. It was so tragic, you can imagine. But despite just a lot of ashes and tragedy, our facility was really like that phoenix that rose from the ashes and decided to do something about it. And it wasn't just meals and raising money through community efforts, but literally the staff, especially in that department, she was part of our housekeeping laundry department. The staff shouldered in every way. Every single person in that department reached out and said, and it wasn't even me directing it. They said, take as much time as you need. We've got you. When you're ready to come back, we're here. But don't worry for a second. And what happened was beyond just that department. The entire facility, in their own way, reached out, and that's a facility that was forever changed, became closer than you can imagine. And moving forward after that employee came back was a completely different culture. And we elevated ourselves because of that terribly tragic experience to be closer and to have each other's backs on a level that I don't think I've ever experienced. So we would never trade that experience. Of course, we wish that never happened. But if there was a silver lining in that experience, it completely transformed a culture, and having each other's backs was always preeminent moving forward in a way that I've never experienced throughout my career.
Brandon, thank you for sharing that. It is heartbreaking, but also uplifting to hear people that came together. And one thing that I wanted to mention about something that you said, and that is we're all pretty good, I think, about having that initial contact. I'm sorry about your loss, send a card, send flowers, whatever that gesture is, which is important. But the grieving person, what happens is we all go back to our regular life, but their life is forever changed. So if you do have the opportunity to keep someone who is grieving in your mind a month later, 6 weeks later, those are the times when reality is setting in, and the gestures of checking in on them, taking them a meal, asking them to go have lunch, those are times that are really, really important. So thank you for bringing that up. Now, Nicole, when we think about if, our role as an HR director or an HR manager, obviously, that is generally the person in the workforce who is tasked with making sure that our teams are well taken care of. So you're going to give us some of the tips from that perspective on what we can do to support any of our team members through grief.
Yeah, thank you, Julianne. I have loved what everybody has said so far. I know I really appreciated the collective grief that you talked about, because it doesn't just have to be the loss of a loved one. It's a divorce, right? It's a loss of job, even the loss of a pet can be very painful for employees going through, any type of grief. So I really appreciated that. I also appreciated, I was super interested in Liz talking about the Harvard study, because, the 4 of us know in this group that I just lost my dad a little over 2 weeks ago. And those 3 stages, oh my gosh, they're so familiar to me. Yes. Amen, Harvard. Because the first was you kind of get mad, my fuse was short with everyone. And then shortly after that, it's the disorganized feeling. And I'm kind of still stuck in that one at this point. It's the forgetting things I don't usually forget and things like that. So how interesting. I love that study. I think that was so interesting and certainly touched home for me. So as an HR director, I think all of those are important, because it's our job to be an advocate for our employees, right? And to help provide them the tools they need to get through blank, whatever it is. So I think one of the first things you would want to do as an HR director is make sure your employee knows about any employee assistance programs that are available to the employees. Brandon touched on that also. There's usually great grief counselors. Most of the time, or I think all of the times I've seen, they are free of cost for a certain number of visits for employees. So what a great resource you can provide as an HR director, right? I think it's also important to not make any real assumptions about what an employee needs or doesn't need. Mostly because employees, everybody grieves differently. I know some people don't want anyone bringing it up, especially at work. They just like the distraction. And other people need to be surrounded by a lot of love and support and appreciate that. So I would just keep that fresh in your mind, that you just don't really want to make any assumptions about what exactly an employee needs. I liked what Brandon said about giving specific, things. Can we take you to lunch on Thursday? Or how about you want to take 2 days off or 5 days off and we'll see you on the weekend? Any kind of options you can give them, just where they can pick and choose, because making choices is another one of those phase 2 things. I think right now, very difficult to make a decision for me right now. So I really appreciated that Brandon brought up. Also, and I would say this is where you kind of make it personal, because we do work together a lot of hours at work, and we do get to know each other, however much. And so sending flowers, sending a card to the family or to that specific employee at their home address, that's a special way to just let the employee know, hey, we know you're grieving right now, and we're thinking of you, and it's personal for us too. So I love that. I think that's an important thing that we should all be doing. And then this is one that I really, really think is important also, and it kind of does touch on what you said about a month from now or 6 weeks from now having check-ins. I find myself constantly replaying in my mind right now, not just memories of my dad and things I did with my dad, but things he learned in his life, things he did in his life, his life story and his legacy. It just plays over and over in my mind right now. So for someone to listen to me for a few minutes as I share that about my dad, oh man, that just means the world. So be there if they happen to want to share something about their loss, whatever the loss is. Take that as a really a special moment you get to share with someone, right? That's going through maybe a major life event. Anyway, maybe the biggest one they've been through yet. So I think that's probably one of the biggest steps I can advise.
Well, I think those are all very thoughtful and business appropriate actions that someone can take. I don't think anyone would have to feel as though they're crossing a line with those suggestions. And Nicole, I am so sorry about the loss of your dad. I know that it was a journey, and his legacy is wonderful. I did read about him. And so thank you for sharing that with all of us.
Thank you, Julianne.
So, we just wanted to give a quick overview of a really deep topic that is hard to talk about. And I hope that today, the four of us were able just to give you some ideas and just some basic information, so that when you're thinking about your workplace and thinking about grief because of everything we've all been through and the things we're continuing to go through in our lives, that we are compassionate with one another. Because in the end, what we all want is a place to go where we work that does feel like family. And I know there are mixed feelings about, do you call it a work family or not? But in the end, we want it to be a place where people feel valued and comfortable. And when we aren't seen, we can't feel that way. And when we don't understand what someone might be going through, we certainly can't extend that empathy and compassion. So thank you, Brandon, Liz, and Nicole, for your time today to talk a little bit with me about grief in the workplace and breaking those taboos, because we all have loss. We all are living in a human experience. So thank you again. I am going to do a shameless plug just because I want to offer some resources. I am the author of and lead author of an anthology. There are 19 women, including me, that share stories of grief and mental health in my book, You Can, You Will, which is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It is an international best-selling book. It tells stories. It helps you understand types of loss and what one can do to overcome that. And then I have a podcast where I talk a little bit more about grief called Brave Enough, Renew, Recreate, Recover You. And that is on all of the major outlets. And so it has some more grief-specific resources for you there. Anyway, again, thank you, Fusion Conflict Strategies. I love this podcast. 1 + 1 = 3, turmoil to triumph. And I am so grateful that we were able to get together today to talk about this important topic.